Under a bleached tropical sun, the jungle of Luzon stood silent, too silent. It was February 1945. Smoke hung heavy over the battered ruins of Santo Tomas internment camp, drifting through the shattered palm trees like a ghost. The faint buzz of insects mixed with something alien. Distant engines, low and methodical, approaching from the west. The women inside the barbed wire compound, Japanese nurses, clerks, and auxiliary staff taken captive after the Manila collapse, froze in place. Their captors had vanished. And now, the sound of boots. Not the quick, clipped step of Imperial infantry, but a slower, heavier rhythm. American rhythm. U.S. Army log, Luzon, February 1945. From behind the shattered gates came the silhouettes, helmets glinting, rifles raised. The prisoners stared, disbelieving. For years, they'd been taught Americans were monsters, soulless machines who burned villages and laughed over corpses. But these soldiers didn't laugh. They didn't even shout. They moved with a grim purpose, sweeping through the ruins, their eyes wary yet oddly gentle. A nurse named Yuki Tanaka, 23 years old, Imperial Army Women's Corps, clutched her hands together, trembling as a sergeant in dusty khaki approached her. "Stay calm," he said softly, voice hoarse from smoke. "You're safe now." U.S. 37th Infantry Division After-Action Report. February 1945. The war in the Pacific was collapsing. Yet here, on this forgotten corner of Luzon, something unthinkable unfolded. Japanese female POWs came face to face with their enemies and realized the enemy did not look like the devils their propaganda had promised. It was the collision of two worlds shaped by fear, fire, and indoctrination. 3 years earlier, in 1942, the Empire had swept across the Pacific with astonishing speed. Singapore fell. Manila surrendered. Tens of thousands of Allied prisoners marched into captivity, many never to return. But the Imperial Japanese Army, rigid in its code of honor, never imagined their own would one day face that same fate. 4 Japanese women in service, nurses, radio operators, and clerks. The concept of capture was unthinkable. They were trained to die before surrender. Imperial Army Women's Corps Training Manual, 1941. Yet by late 1944, reality shattered ideology. The U.S. had returned to the Philippines. General MacArthur's promise, "I shall return," was no longer rhetoric but thunder. Bombers from the 5th Air Force turned Japanese strongholds into scorched wastelands. The seas that once belonged to the rising sun now belonged to submarines and aircraft carriers. Convoys carrying supplies from the home islands vanished beneath American torpedoes. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Inside the collapsing front, communication lines broke down. Female auxiliaries, once stationed safely behind the lines, found themselves trapped amid chaos. Units retreated through jungles teeming with disease, starvation, and panic. Orders became whispers. Rumors spoke of Americans taking prisoners alive, offering food and medicine. To the indoctrinated mind, such mercy was impossible, until they saw it.in one recorded instance. A Japanese nurse convoy, 30 women and 4 wounded soldiers, was intercepted by U.S. cavalry troopers near the town of Santo Tomas. Expecting execution, the women prepared for suicide, clutching grenades and morphine kits. But the Americans ordered them to stand down and provided water. Sergeant Frank Delgado, a medic from New Mexico, described it later. "They were terrified of us. Wouldn't drink until one of us did first." U.S. 37th Medical Battalion Diary, February 1945. The contrast was staggering. These women, taught absolute loyalty to the emperor, had spent years believing surrender was worse than death. Now they faced an enemy who treated them with restraint. What neither side realized was that this fragile encounter would become one of the war's strangest reversals of perception, a moment when propaganda cracked. Under the weight of humanity, beyond the jungle clearing, war still raged. Manila was being ground into dust. The U.S. 1st Cavalry Division fought street by street against fanatical Japanese defenders who refused to yield, even as their command structure collapsed. The once proud imperial forces were fragmenting into desperate pockets, some still fighting, others starving, others simply lost. MacArthur Headquarters Report, February 1945. But in camps like Santo Tomas, a new kind of confusion took hold. Japanese female POWs, many still in their tattered uniforms, watched American medics treat the wounded, Japanese and American alike. They watched officers remove their helmets in silence over the dead. And in that silence, fear turned into disbelief. One diary recovered from the site, believed to belong to a Japanese clerk named Fumiko Watanabe, captures the transformation. They feed us rice. They share tobacco. I saw one soldier cry as he carried a dying Japanese child. Everything they told us was a lie. Recovered diary, Santo Tomas, 1945. For American troops, the shock ran both ways. Many had never seen Japanese women before, let alone as soldiers or prisoners. Years of brutal fighting on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan had dehumanized the enemy into faceless silhouettes in the jungle. Now, standing before frightened nurses with trembling hands, they saw not warriors but people, thin, exhausted, and terrified. Yet beneath this fragile truce lay deep scars. The same day American medics distributed rations at Santo Tomas, other units were discovering the horrors of Manila's civilian massacres. Over 100,000 Filipino civilians were dead, burned, or bayoneted in the city's ruins. The revelation hardened hearts across the Allied ranks. Compassion coexisted with rage, mercy with vengeance. U.S. 6th Army Intelligence Summary, March 1945. For the Japanese prisoners, this contradiction was terrifying. Would the Americans' mercy last? Or was it merely a pause before judgment? Days passed before they understood they were not to be executed. They were to be processed, questioned, and eventually transferred to camps under the Geneva Convention, something the Imperial Army itself had ignored for years. War Department POW procedures, 1945. Among the guards, whispers spread about how unusual the situation was. Japanese female POWs were almost unheard of. Most women in the Imperial service were instructed to die by grenade or cyanide rather than face capture. The fact that these women had survived, and that the Americans had allowed them to, was an anomaly in a war that rarely showed mercy on either side. At night, the jungle echoed with distant artillery. The war was far from over. But inside the barbed wire camp, something shifted, a fracture in the ideological wall separating East and West. Yuki Tanaka, who once dreamed of dying for the emperor, now watched an American mechanic repairing a generator under the moonlight, humming quietly as he worked. It was a small sound, human, fragile, alive. And for the first time, she wondered if survival itself could be a form of defiance. WWII dawn, American supply trucks rolled in, their white stars bright against the mud. New orders arrived. All prisoners were to be relocated north. For the women, it meant the end of fear, but also the beginning of questions they couldn't yet ask. For the soldiers, it was another checkpoint. Another moment in a war that blurred right and wrong. But none could imagine what lay ahead. The interrogations, the moral reckonings, and the revelations that would expose what these women had seen, what they had believed, and what the war had turned them into. Because soon, as the U.S. intelligence officers began to listen, they would uncover a secret that would shock even the hardened veterans of the Pacific Front. The interrogation tent smelled of kerosene and damp canvas. Inside, a single light bulb swung overhead, throwing harsh shadows on the faces of the captives. It was March 3, 1945. Manila's fires still smoldered miles away. Rows of Japanese female POWs sat silently, their uniforms in tatters, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. Across from them sat the American interrogators, calm, efficient, and expressionless. On the table lay not weapons, but clipboards, ration tins, and maps marked in red. U.S. Army Intelligence Corps report, March 1945. The Americans had come not for vengeance, but for information. The women were clerks, radio operators, and nurses. They had seen the machinery of the Imperial Army from the inside. They knew call signs, supply routes, and evacuation orders. What stunned the interrogators wasn't the information they gave, it was the loyalty they still held. Even in defeat, they spoke of the emperor with reverence, as if faith could shield them from the ashes outside. Military Intelligence Service notes, 1945. But among the prisoners, one name stood out, Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka. Once a field nurse in the 14th Army's Medical Corps, She had served on Bataan during the first Japanese advance in 1942. She knew the terrain, the tactics, and, most importantly, the weaknesses of her own command. The Americans noticed her calm precision and began asking detailed questions. What they didn't realize was that Yuki's answers would unlock one of the hidden reasons the Imperial defense had crumbled: the silent collapse of Japanese field medicine, while Allied armies advanced with mobile surgical units, refrigeration trucks, and penicillin. Japan's medical system had collapsed under blockade. By 1945, many Imperial field hospitals had no morphine, no antibiotics, and no plasma. Surgeons reused instruments sterilized over open flames. Wounds that would have healed on Allied lines meant death in Japanese ones. Imperial Medical Bureau memo, January 1945. The difference was technological and catastrophic. American logistics, powered by a vast industrial base, sustained life where Japan's isolation bred decay. Portable refrigeration units built by Carrier and Frigidaire kept plasma and blood viable for weeks. Each U.S. infantry division carried thousands of units of whole blood, tagged, frozen, and transported under standardized procedures pioneered by Dr. Charles Drew and the American Red Cross. War Department Technical Bulletin, 1944. Yuki Tanaka's testimony confirmed what Allied analysts suspected. Japanese medical infrastructure was crumbling not because of incompetence, but because of engineering disparity. Japan's industrial base simply couldn't sustain the temperature-controlled systems modern medicine required. Field hospitals lacked even the simplest electrical generators. Many relied on hand-crank suction pumps. The Americans' technological hidden advantage wasn't just bombs or tanks. It was logistics as science. U.S. Army Medical Service Review, 1945. Inside the tent. Lieutenant Tanaka listened as American medics discussed something incomprehensible to her: blood typing stations, plasma sterilization, and saline production. To a woman who'd boiled surgical needles in rainwater, this was sorcery. Yet it was real. The Americans had turned factories into arteries and supply lines into veins. Their war machine didn't just kill, it healed. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence officers cross-referenced Tanaka's details with captured field manuals and intercepted transmissions. One such report revealed that the Japanese 31st Army had lost over 40% of its wounded to infection before even reaching triage stations. On the American side, comparable rates were under 8%. Medical Statistics Bureau, April 1945. This invisible war of medicine was reshaping the Pacific conflict. The ability to save men faster than the enemy could replace theirs wasn't glamorous, but it was decisive. American divisions could fight longer and harder and recover faster. Every plasma shipment was a reinforcement of morale. Every functioning generator meant another day of combat readiness. The interrogations continued for weeks. The women were moved to a larger facility at New Bilibid Prison, guarded but treated according to Geneva protocols. For the first time, they received regular meals and medical care. Ironically, their first true contact with advanced modern medicine came as prisoners. American doctors cataloged their malnutrition, dysentery, and infections. One physician noted in his diary, "They are astonished by penicillin, as if it were magic. Some cry when it works." Medical Officers Field Journal. March 1945. Yuki herself was treated for a shrapnel wound in her left leg, an injury sustained during an air raid near Tarlac months earlier. She later described, through a translator, how her entire surgical unit had been obliterated by a single B-25 strike. No evacuation, no medicine, no chance. She had carried the infection for weeks, expecting death. The American surgeon who cleaned the wound told her she would walk again. She didn't believe him, until she did. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence used her insights to reconstruct the state of Japan's logistics. What emerged was staggering. The Empire's medical supply network depended on coastal convoys, slow, unarmored ships constantly hunted by submarines. Between 1943 and 1945, over 75% of those convoys had been sunk. By the time the Philippines fell, Japan's field hospitals were operating at less than 20% capacity. U.S. Submarine Warfare Assessment, 1946. The Americans realized they hadn't just destroyed Japan's armies, they had destroyed its ability to sustain human life in the field. That revelation wasn't one of triumph, but of grim awe. The same systems that delivered victory also inflicted humanitarian collapse. Back in the interrogation camp, something unexpected began to happen. The prisoners, no longer facing execution, started volunteering information, not from fear, but curiosity. They asked to see the equipment. They wanted to understand how their enemies could make machines that cooled blood or powered lights in the jungle. A captured Japanese technician wept when he saw a portable generator. "It's smaller than ours," he whispered. "But it works." U.S. Army Engineering Corps debrief. 1945. For the Americans, these moments were as revealing as any battle. They showed how deeply ideology had blinded both sides. The war had been fought not only over territory, but also over imagination. What each nation believed possible. Where Japan believed in spirit, America had invested in systems. Where Japan sought sacrifice, America sought sustainability. And in that quiet realization lay the war's cruelest irony. The side that preserved life better WONWII. The weeks passed. Lieutenant Tanaka began working as an interpreter between her fellow prisoners and American medics. Slowly, the mistrust eased. When a fever outbreak hit the camp, the Americans treated everyone equally, POWs and guards alike. Tanaka watched as penicillin worked miracles her textbooks never mentioned. She began recording notes, diagrams, and procedures, perhaps to take home, if home still existed. But outside the camp walls, the war pressed on. Okinawa burned. Kamikazes screamed into U.S. ships by the hundreds. Tokyo's night skies turned red with firebombs. The world beyond the fences was still collapsing. Yet inside that camp, for the first time, there was a fragile alliance of understanding, built not by treaties, but by sutures and syringes. Then, one morning, the prisoners awoke to the sound of aircraft overhead, not American bombers, but transport planes. The war was entering its final, brutal months, and the Americans were preparing for something even larger. The prisoners would soon learn that their testimonies, their knowledge, and their faces would play an unexpected role in what came next, a role that would shape how America understood the enemy it was about to defeat completely. Because in the shadow of surrender, before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these women would become witnesses to the empire's unraveling and to the power of compassion in a world built for destruction. The summer of 1945. The Pacific War was drawing its last, agonizing breaths. Across the horizon of the Philippines, smoke no longer rose from battlefields, but from reconstruction, bridges, hospitals, and communication lines. The thunder of artillery had faded into the hum of diesel engines and the clatter of supply trucks. Yet for the Japanese female POWs, the war's end brought no simple peace, only reflection, guilt, and disbelief at the world now revealed to them. U.S. 6th Army Transition Report, August 1945. They were still in captivity when the news reached them. August 15, 1945. Japan had surrendered. The Emperor's voice, carried through static and shortwave in the first radio broadcast ever heard by his people, trembled with solemn finality. Endure the unendurable, bear the unbearable. The women sat in silence, tears streaming, unable to reconcile the impossible, that their divine emperor had spoken of surrender. For the Americans standing nearby, it was a surreal moment, their most formidable enemy defeated by his own words, not by the bomb or the bayonet. Radio Tokyo transcript, August 1945. Within days, orders came for the transfer of all Japanese POWs, including the women, to centralized holding camps for repatriation. The same American soldiers who had once fought across jungles and rice fields now escorted their former enemies with care. Food rations were doubled. Medical records were prepared for return. At New Bilibid, the female prisoners were issued new clothes, deloused, and photographed for identification. It was not victory these Americans felt, but relief. Relief that the killing was over. War Department POW Repatriation Report, September 1945. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka was among those processed. She had changed, no longer the rigid, fearful figure who had first met American soldiers through barbed wire. She now walked with a limp, healed by enemy doctors. Her journals from captivity, later archived by U.S. intelligence, read less like propaganda and more like an awakening. The Americans are methodical, she wrote. They fight with steel but think with compassion. Their engineers have conquered death in ways we never understood. Recovered Prisoner Journal. October 1945. Those engineers she referred to. Men like Charles Kettering of General Motors, Dr. Drew of the Red Cross, and Major Raymond Hoofnagel of the U.S. Army Medical Corps had unknowingly influenced the fate of every soldier and prisoner across the Pacific. Their designs, refrigeration systems, portable oxygen units, blood storage, and field sterilization gear had created the unseen infrastructure that made survival possible. War historians would later call it the victory of systems. U.S. Army Engineering Division Memo. 1946. For the Japanese women, those systems became tangible symbols of defeat and rebirth. The camp's infirmary became a school of sorts. American medics demonstrated procedures, saline drips, anesthesia, and wound irrigation. The women watched, learned, and assisted. Slowly, the fear dissolved into curiosity. Some even began teaching English words to new arrivals. For them, knowledge became the only form of atonement left, but not all hearts could heal. Among the captives, a few still clung to imperial ideals. They whispered that surrender was shame, that returning home alive was dishonor. Some refused to eat. Some wept for comrades who had chosen suicide over survival. The Americans did not understand this kind of grief, but they respected it. Chaplains and medics worked quietly to keep them alive, even when they didn't wish to live. Medical Psychological Assessment, October 1945. When the U.S. began processing testimonies for the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, several of these women were called as witnesses. Their statements shocked even Allied officers hardened by years of bloodshed. They spoke of forced labor camps, of orders to kill wounded Allied prisoners, and of indoctrination drills teaching them that Americans were subhuman beasts. And yet, they had seen the opposite. One testified, "They treated our wounds, and we had no words for that mercy." War Crimes Witness Transcript. 1946. In the months that followed, Lieutenant Tanaka and a handful of others volunteered to assist occupation authorities as translators and clerks. To American intelligence, they were invaluable. To themselves, they were ghosts, caught between loyalty and truth, past and future. In 1946, Tanaka returned to Japan aboard the hospital ship USS Haven. She stepped onto a homeland she no longer recognized. Her city, Yokohama, was rubble. Her family gone. But she carried something else home, a notebook filled with diagrams of American medical systems, pinned secretly in her tent. U.S. Navy Repatriation Log, April 1946. That notebook would later resurface in post-war Japan's Reconstruction years. Its sketches of refrigeration coils and plasma bottles were traced by students at a newly reopened medical school in Tokyo, students who would help modernize Japan's entire field medicine system. In this quiet way, a captured nurse's experience became the seed of transformation. Meanwhile, in America, stories of compassion in captivity filtered home through veterans' letters. Many soldiers could not forget the faces of the Japanese women they had guarded, eyes once filled with terror, later softened by gratitude. For men who had fought at Polilliu, Iwo Jima, or Leyte, that humanity offered a kind of peace they hadn't expected. It reminded them that even in total war, decency had not died. Letters of the Pacific, Veterans Archive. 1947. By the early 1950s, when Japan and the United States had become allies against new Cold War threats, the memory of those wartime encounters took on a strange new meaning. Former enemies stood side by side building hospitals, exchanging technology, and sending medical teams to Korea. The irony was not lost on anyone who remembered the camps of Luzon, the same generators that once ran POW. Infirmaries now powered peacekeeping hospitals. Psychologists studying POW interactions would later call what happened in the Philippines a reversal of moral conditioning. The propaganda that once divided soldier from human had been dismantled not by speeches, but by small acts of compassion. U.S. Strategic Psychological Review, 1952. In her later years, Yuki Tanaka, now a nurse in post-war Tokyo, was interviewed for an NHK documentary. Her words, calm and reflective, carried the weight of a lifetime. When I first saw the Americans, I thought they were monsters. But they showed me a machine that made ice. I realized then that the world I'd known was built on lies. They conquered not with cruelty, but with creation. Dramatized Composite NHK Oral History Project. 1970. Across the decades, her story became a quiet lesson in the strange symmetry of war. Behind every clash of armies were engineers, doctors, and workers who shaped the outcome without firing a shot. Behind every ideology were people, afraid, loyal, and desperate to survive. The war had turned them into enemies, but survival turned them into witnesses. And so, when historians today study the Pacific War, they often cite the weapons, the Zero fighters, the B-29s, and the atomic bombs. But buried in the archives are the smaller victories, the plasma bottle, the generator, and the kindness shown to a prisoner. These were the quiet revolutions that redefined the meaning of power itself. Because in the end, the story of those Japanese female POWs is not one of defeat or shame. It is one of discovery. They came face to face with an enemy and found, to their astonishment, not vengeance but empathy. And in that revelation lay the truest victory of all, that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion could still burn brighter than war. In modern war, as one veteran later wrote, it is not the strongest who endure, but those who remember what it means to be human. Dramatized Composite Pacific Veterans Memoir, 1953.